For the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about Daniel and how to navigate an increasingly secular and even sometimes hostile culture. And a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how Daniel was able to navigate the culture that he found himself in with wisdom and tact and choosing his battles in a way that best glorified God. You know, he wasn't a closet believer, but he wasn't a jerk and over the top and in your face either. And then last week, we talked about Daniel's posture towards this people, the Babylonians, who had committed such terrible atrocities towards Daniel, his family, and his people, and how Daniel dealt with them with tremendous understanding and compassion, and how he served in love, and how he gained favor through righteousness. And so we see that Daniel was a person of peace and goodwill. And I believe that as Christians, we are to strive to be a people of peace and goodwill. However, sometimes when navigating culture, and especially when someone takes umbrage at our faith or reacts against our faith in some way, sometimes there are no easy solutions. Sometimes there is no easy way to navigate around the culture. Sometimes we just simply need to take a stand. And so that's what I want to talk about today in context of kind of where we've been over the last couple of weeks. What exactly does that look like? When do we take a stand? How do we take a stand? Why do we take a stand? And I believe that it's here where Daniel can help us quite a bit as well. Because Daniel learned that regardless of how understanding you are, or compassionate, or gracious, or loving, or righteous, sometimes you cannot avoid conflict with the world. Sometimes you simply need to stand for what you believe in. For example, in Daniel chapter 3, and that's where we'll be today, and if you have your Bibles, I would encourage you to turn there. But in Daniel chapter 3, there are three young Hebrews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they are thrown into a fiery furnace for refusing to bow down to a 90-foot image of gold. And later on, we see Daniel being thrown into a lion's den because he would not stop praying, which was illegal at that particular time. Praying was illegal, and so they threw him into the lion's den. And so we see that the story of Daniel is one that not only helps us navigate a hostile culture or a secular culture, but it also helps us navigate hostile situations. Those situations where simply being a person of faith invites consequences into your life. And so I'd like to pick up the story of Daniel in chapter 3, and we'll read the first 12 verses. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all of the other provincial officials assembled before the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "This is what you're commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language." Remember, they were Babylon was the center of the world, and all of the nations ran through Babylon. And he said that as soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You have issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who paid no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. Prosperity in America sometimes distorts our Christianity, because there are some of us, being Christians, who believe that being a person of faith automatically brings health and peace and prosperity to your life. And God never promised us this kind of peace. You know, he promised us spiritual peace and spiritual abundance and spiritual prosperity in spades, but he never said that if you were a person of faith, that you will avoid all suffering and all trouble and all conflict. In fact, Jesus made a point to go out of his way and say that sometimes your faith will invite conflict and it will invite suffering. Like in Matthew 5:11, when Jesus says, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me." Or in Philippians 1:29, where Paul says, "For it has been granted to you on Christ's behalf not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for him." Or in 2 Timothy 3:12, "Everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted." And we see this in the story of the three young Hebrews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They didn't do anything to anyone. And yet they found themselves in a no-win situation. They could not navigate out of this one while maintaining their spiritual integrity. By simply being who they were, it brought them to be at odds with the system, with the government, and even with certain individuals. And so being who they were was not tolerated. Their worldview, their perspective, their faith was not tolerated. Now, this may raise some questions, because some of you are probably thinking, or maybe thinking, well, I thought the Babylonians were polytheistic. I thought they believed in all kinds of gods, and wouldn't that make them rather tolerant of people who held to all of these, various other gods and different beliefs? And the Babylonians were polytheistic, but they believed that their gods were superior to the other gods. That everybody else's gods were inferior, therefore no one else's gods or the worship of anyone else's gods is not going to be tolerated. And so Nebuchadnezzar sets up this 90-foot image of gold, which is the conglomeration of a number of their primary deities, all kind of wrapped up into one. And he makes a proclamation, a law, a decree, that everyone has to bow down and worship this image, or else there are going to be consequences. And some of the astrologers, who for whatever reason must have had it in for the Jews, went and told on them. Somewhere along the line, these astrologers had developed bad blood towards the Hebrews, and so they were going to take them out. And so they went and they tattled on the Hebrews, knowing full well that the punishment, the decree for this, was that the Hebrews would be thrown into a fiery furnace, that they were going to be killed. And so they intentionally went to Nebuchadnezzar with this aim. I think it's important to point out at this particular time that the Old Testament strictly forbids astrology as an occult practice, and no Hebrew would ever participate in such a thing, and that the Hebrews had to basically go through the Babylonian university system, and part of the curriculum was studying astrology. And so they were going to run against these astrologers, and certainly their views were going to come out, and so the astrologers picked up on the Jewish attitudes, and probably felt judged by the Hebrews and considered the Hebrews people of hate, and so they sought to kill them. Isn't it interesting how hateful people can be when accusing others of being people of hate? We see this dynamic of what the Hebrews experienced in our culture, increasingly more and more in our society, and frighteningly more and more in our society as our faith brings us into conflict with not only individuals and not only the system, but even now the government, and we'll get to that a little bit. I'm not going to dive into that and all that kind of stuff, but we see these sort of conflicts, and the most obvious example is with people. I'll give you for instance, a few years back, Cindy and I were invited to go have dinner with the family of one of our daughter's boyfriends. And we graciously accepted. It was a very nice invitation. They're very nice people. We were looking forward to it and thought this was going to be a lovely evening. And we were then warned ahead of time that it might be awkward. And we're like, well, what do you mean it might be awkward? Well, apparently, our daughter's boyfriend's uncle is gay, and he lives out of town, but he was coming in town because it was for a graduation. He and his husband were coming into town and were going to come to the dinner until they heard that we were going to be there and that I was a Baptist minister. And he didn't want to come, but the family insisted. And so he agreed to come, he and his husband, but they were not happy about it. And so they're like, okay, come on and have dinner with us. And the point being is that they formed opinions of us based on stereotypes and reacted to our faith without ever having met us or really knowing anything about us as individuals or as a people. And so both Cindy and I made a point to make every effort to be gracious and kind and understanding and engaging. And we ended up having a lovely evening, and we conversed about a variety of topics, and we even were able to get to faith and Christianity and spirituality. And it is my prayer that through that conversation that maybe we were able to soften their hearts, towards Christ and Christianity and all that sort of thing. But the point being that sometimes just simply being who we are brings us into tension with other people. And in fact, there are some people who aren't even nearly as gracious as the men that we had dinner with. For example, I found this excerpt on an atheist website. This guy was confessing in his blog, I've considered myself an atheist for about 4 or 5 years now, maybe a couple more even. Since then, I've always been pretty outspoken about atheism. But one thing I see myself doing is I feel a real hate of Christians, more so than any other religious cult, growing inside of me. I cannot just read a story or watch a video of a Christian without this huge fireball of impatience and anger coming up through my body. And so again, sometimes in our culture today, much more so than 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30, 40, 50 years ago, it just seems to be, progressively more and more true that just being who we are as believers will lead us towards tension and maybe even being at odds with people whose worldview is different than ours. We also see this with the government infringing now more and more on various religious liberties. In fact, I just finished reading a book where they traced 12 Supreme Court decisions over the last 20 to 30 years that have increasingly infringed upon our religious liberties. There are hundreds of illustrations that I could cite. I will give you one. In Sacramento, California, a 12-year-old student named Esther disagreed with what her biology teacher was teaching about evolution, and so she brought a tract to school on what she believed about creation. And she didn't show it to a bunch of people or anything like that. She showed it to two of her girlfriends. One of the girlfriends went home and told her mother, who then called the school and complained. Esther was then called into the principal's office, given a formal reprimand, and then forced to write and sign an incident report confessing her wrongdoing. That was not the end of it. On numerous occasions, at least 3, maybe even 4 times, she was then called back to the principal's office, was told that her confession was insufficient, that she did not understand or appreciate the gravity of how wrong she was, and was forced on multiple occasions to rewrite and sign her confession until it was acceptable. Here's the point. She was not allowed to have her own ideas. She was not allowed to have her own view or opinions on things. The only worldview that was acceptable was the one that is endorsed by the state. And this sort of thing is happening more and more. Again, many examples, the firing of Chief Cochran here in Atlanta, the whole Hobby Lobby situation. I mean, it just goes on and on. And then we get to the system. And again, we exist in a system that is growing increasingly intolerant of people of faith, and especially Christians. And I won't give you a bunch of examples, although I could give you some similar examples to the one that I just gave. I really want to go more into why this happens, because I think the text tells us in the last line of verse 12, where it says, where the astrologers said about the Hebrews, they neither serve our God nor worship the images that we have set up. Now, we no longer worship the Babylonian gods in our culture, but we do have our gods. In fact, over the last 100 years, and especially since the 60s and with the postmodern revolution, we have had many gods vying for supremacy. And several have clearly emerged victorious from the fray. The gods of humanism, individualism, scientism, materialism, lasciviousness. And these are gods that don't look kindly upon the Christian worldview and really are not very tolerant of Christian viewpoints, and many stand directly in opposition to these things. And so in essence, what is going on is that every time a Christian is ridiculed or excluded or rejected or maybe even persecuted for believing in pro-family values, or believing in creationism over evolution, or even actually sharing the gospel, because in many workplaces and whatnot, we're no longer allowed to have Bibles or to share your faith or things like that. What in essence the larger society, what in essence the larger system is saying is, we reject you and we renounce you because you do not serve our gods or worship the images that we have set up. And so we continue in the story. Pick it up in verse 13. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I have made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." The Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Now again, the Hebrews are accused of not serving the Babylonian gods. They had a very different worldview than the others in Babylon. They weren't going along with the program, and so that worldview was not tolerated, and there were consequences. I think it's also important to point out that the young Hebrews did everything right. Like, this didn't happen because they navigated the situation wrong, or they committed some big faux pas, or they were judgmental, it wasn't that they did anything wrong. In fact, by all accounts, they were, again, very understanding and compassionate and gracious and compliant and hardworking and prosperous and productive. And again, by all accounts, pretty much everyone, I guess with the exception of the astrologers, liked them and thought well of them. But in spite of how good they were, in spite of their obvious righteousness, the king was still furious. And he was not going to tolerate their differing beliefs. In fact, their refusal to bow down and worship the Babylonian gods was seen as gross insubordination, and they needed to be punished. I think it's also important to point out that the 3 young Hebrews could have avoided the entire sordid affair by just simply bowing down. And it would have been so easy for them to rationalize and justify doing so. They could have thought to themselves, our people need us. Who else is going to advocate for the Hebrews? I mean, we just get run roughshod over, and they need a voice. They need someone to speak for them. And what good can we do the people if we are dead? And so we'll just do this little thing to achieve the greater good. Or they could have said, when in Babylon, you just do as the Babylonians do. We need to be culturally relevant. And so we'll just bow down this one time and God will understand. Or they could have said, we'll bow down, but we won't actually worship the idol. We'll be bowing physically, but we won't be worshiping that idol. We will be worshiping Yahweh in our hearts. Or they could have said, we'll just bow down this one little time and then just ask for God's forgiveness later, and it's, no big deal. Or they could have thought to themselves, Nebuchadnezzar really has done so much for us when he conquered our culture and pretty much razed Jerusalem and did all of these terrible things. He could have killed us and taken us out, but instead he's brought us to the palace and he's given us these nice apartments and he gives us food from his table and we have these really cush jobs. And so, it really would be a tremendous offense to Nebuchadnezzar to not bow down. So we'll just do this one little thing and certainly God would understand. You ever notice how easy it is to compromise? Like when something's on the line, like when it matters, like when there's a real cost, like for them when your life is on the line. Or a grade, or a job, or an important relationship, or your reputation. And yet, throughout Scripture, and especially in the New Testament, we see that God desires faith under fire. That faith in the fire is like really important. And God goes out of his way to highlight how important that is, throughout Scripture and especially in the New Testament. Let me give you just one quick example of how God does this. For example, in Revelation 7, when there's this big pause in heaven and God is about to usher in his kingdom and everything's about to go down and the major player comes in and it's Jesus. And Jesus is revealed to his creation, and everybody just goes nuts because he's just awesome, just over the top, incredible. And John, who's writing all of this down, notices that there are people with him, those in white robes. And he's like, wow, who are these people? Who gets to walk with Jesus? Who is in his entourage? Who are these that he has gathered around himself in this special way? And the angel says, these are those who have come out of the great tribulation and have been faithful unto death. And that's not why they did it. They did it because they loved Jesus and would never think of betraying him in their hearts. And we see the similar dynamic, I believe, going on with the three Hebrews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They loved God more than they feared Babylon. And I suspect that's how God desires that we relate to our culture. Yes, there are going to be times when it's hard to be a Christian. There are going to be times when we're going to have to stand up and own who we are. And the question is, are we going to love God more than we fear the culture? Are we going to fear God more than we fear the culture? Because the bottom line is that regardless of how many people say terrible things against God or fall away or don't believe in him, he is still God. Regardless of how much the culture, the system rejects God, he is still God. Regardless of how much the government denies God, he is still God. We read on. Verse 24, then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men we tied up and threw in the fire? They replied, certainly, O king. He said, look, I see these 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God. He's changed his tune. Servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. And they saw the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their head singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses to be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. I opened up the message by reminding us that God doesn't necessarily promise us peace. That at times we may be required to suffer for our faith, and that our faith may actually bring conflict into our lives. Furthermore, I want to point out before we go into this that neither does the scriptures necessarily promise deliverance. That just because the Hebrews were delivered from their furnace doesn't necessarily mean that we will be delivered as well. For example, how many Christian martyrs have existed over the centuries all around the world, and now numbering in the millions? Did God deliver them? Or the apostles? All except John, who died a martyr's death, and he suffered a fate. I think I'd rather be dead than boiled in oil. Did God deliver them? Or how about Jesus? Did God deliver him from his persecution and from the suffering that he went through? No. In fact, it was necessary. It was God that actually sent him to the cross. And so I think it's important for us not to spiritualize the passage, which we're really good at doing today, and interpret the passage to mean that just because God delivered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from this terrible fate, from the fiery furnace, that God is going to deliver us from our fiery furnaces as well. Now, this does not mean that God is not able. It does not mean that God cannot deliver you, because he certainly can, and there are many wonderful stories and many wonderful testimonies of how God delivers people at various times in various ways. However, if in his sovereignty he decides that you need to go through whatever it is that you're going through, for whatever reasons that he knows, we need to be okay with that. In fact, we even need to rejoice in it, which is the subject for another message that I'll get to in the new year when I talk directly about persecution. But that doesn't mean that there are not some incredible promises that are found here in Daniel chapter 3, because there are. The first one, I believe, the text illustrates that in times of trouble, in times of conflict, that we can count on the presence of God. Who's the fourth man in the fiery furnace? Remember what Nebuchadnezzar said? He looks like the son of the gods. Truer words have never been spoken. Because scholars are pretty much in agreement, and I mean, it's certainly the way I see it, is that this is none other than Jesus Christ himself. I mean, they're in the midst of their trial, in the midst of when the fire is the hottest, when the trouble is the worst, when the darkness is the deepest, who's right in there in the middle with them, talking with them, encouraging them. And the way I think the text presents this, the image of it, is like they're sitting down and they're like having a conversation. Can you imagine what was said? Can you imagine what that was like, to be there and to experience the presence of God? And I'm not saying that we're going to experience this big dramatic physical manifestation of Jesus shining in the light of his glory as we sing. But I'll tell you what, time after time, when personally I've walked some dark roads, and as a pastor, I've had the privilege of walking with others. It's like time after time after time after time, the one thing I hear is that, you know what, Pastor? God's presence is with me. It's real, and that's what's getting me through this. And we can count on this. He promised, he said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. We can also count on God using our faithfulness to astound others and get their attention. And we see this all throughout church history as well, not just here in the book of Daniel. In fact, it says that the church has been built on the blood of the martyrs. And what does that mean? What are they talking about? And it's the exact dynamic we see here in Daniel. And it's this idea that when you are willing to pay the price, when you are willing to suffer for your faith in full view of everyone sees, including your persecutors, including the ones who are doing these very things to you. And they don't get it. It doesn't compute. It doesn't process. There's nothing in this world that inspires that kind of loyalty. The idea here is that righteousness is impressive. And faithfulness is impressive. Faith in the fire is impressive. Nebuchadnezzar was so impressed by the testimony and the things that he saw, and these guys willing to go to the mat for their God. And that's what he said. He said because they were willing to only worship, or not willing to worship any other God but their own. And he talks about how it was their heart and their attitude that really impressed him. So then he makes this proclamation that anyone who says anything negative about their God, they're going to be the ones who are going to, be cut into pieces and their house razed and all these sorts of things. And I'm not saying that Nebuchadnezzar was a Christian, so, that's how he's going to react. But the bottom line is that these guys made a huge impression on him. And so as you find yourselves in situations where your faith is being marginalized, where there's tension, where there's a cost, it's important to understand that people are watching and that God can and will use that to get people's attention, and probably in a way that no other way can. Like all of your arguments, maybe your little tracts and, putting a bumper sticker on your car, like more than all that stuff. When you're really willing to own it in the face of the fire, it's like, wow, man, those guys, they got something. And then the final promise that we see here is the promise of reward. And listen, I'm not talking about like being restored to their positions and given higher positions, and now they're like, the highest positions in the land and everything that goes along with that. And I guess that's great. And sometimes righteousness does result in earthly reward. Honestly, much of the time nowadays, probably not. But again, that's not why we do it. Here's the reward. Go back to the fiery furnace. They're walking with Jesus, right? Go back to Revelation 7. They're walking with Jesus. There's something about, I guess, that moment in that heart when you just let it go. Like you let your stuff go. Like, I don't care anymore about my reputation. I don't care about this job that much to disown my God. I don't care about the grade that much to advocate evolution in my paper, or whatever it happens to be. But when you let go of yourself, and it just opens you up to the Lord and a deeper walk with Him in a way that just doesn't happen otherwise. And maybe it's even a revelation to yourself. You're like, man, this is the hardest thing I've ever had to do. And it's in that place where God meets us. And our relationship with Him just goes all the way to the ceiling. And we know that there's that intimacy and that walk that we can have here now, but I think that certainly carries over, into eternity. And it is those who are willing to be faithful unto death that the Scripture says will receive a crown of life. And so it talks about, honor and reward for those who demonstrate faith in the fire. And I know it doesn't sound like much now. We talk about reward here in this world, and we're like, I don't know, I can't imagine anything better than just being in heaven. I can't imagine anything better than being with Jesus. But here's the thing, Jesus and the other New Testament writers insist that it's so much more than worth it. And that we need to invest in treasure in God's kingdom rather than earthly treasure. And when we get there, we're going to be so glad we did. I'll close with a story. One of the early church fathers was a guy by the name of John Chrysostom. And he was brought before the Roman emperor and was commanded to renounce his faith. And at first, the emperor wasn't even going to kill him. He said, unless you renounce your faith, we're just going to banish you from your father's land, which is the language that they used. He said, I'm going to banish you from your father's land. We're going to kick you out of the country. And in that day and time, Roman Empire was big, and every other place was considered uncivilized and a bunch of barbarians, and no one would ever want to live there. So we're going to basically take your life from you and everything that you value. And John, very casually, almost friendly, said, well, you cannot banish me from my father's land because all lands belong to my father. And there's no place that I can go that does not belong to him. Well, the emperor grew agitated at this, and he said, then I'm just going to take your possessions and all of your treasures. And John replied, well, you see, you cannot take my treasures because all of my true treasure is secure in heaven. And the emperor grew even angrier, and he said, then I'm going to take you and put you in a place of solitary, where you will not have even another friend to talk to for the rest of your life. And again, John said, you cannot. For I have a friend that sticks closer than a brother. He is my elder brother, Jesus Christ. And he has promised never to leave me or forsake me, and has promised to be with me until the very end of the age. And at this, the emperor lost it. And he said, then I will take your very life. And again, Chrysostom replied, you cannot, for my life is forever hidden in Christ with God. I know that, none of us will ever have to stand before the emperor. But increasingly, more and more in our society, there are those who just don't share our worldview, don't appreciate our worldview, don't want to tolerate our worldview, and want to lessen our voice. And there are going to be times when we will be tempted to deny the Lord who saved us. To be quiet, to capitulate, to bow down in whatever ways, shapes, and forms that our society demands. And again, going back to the book of Daniel, we saw that we can navigate around a lot of this through compassion and grace and love and righteousness and service and being strategic and all of those things, and we can gain favor quite a bit that way. But there will be situations that we will not be able to navigate. And in such times, maybe even if it costs us, maybe especially if it costs us, again, like Daniel, not in a way that's a jerk, not in your face, but we don't want to be a closet Christian either, that we stand and we own it. We own who we are. We own our faith. We own our worldview, not in a defiant way, not in a belligerent way, maybe even in a way of peace. Daniel and his friends, listen, Nebuchadnezzar, we appreciate you, appreciate everything you've done for us. We just can't bow down to the idol. There will be those situations for many of us. And I think in those times, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that it's important for us to love God more than we fear culture, than we fear society, than we fear the repercussions, knowing that there are promises for us when we do, that God's presence will go with us, that he will use us and our faithfulness to get people's attention in ways that we couldn't otherwise do, and that in doing so, there will be great reward. And so I encourage you, I challenge you. I know that it's not easy, especially the students, those people who are like my age. They're like, what's he talking about? How hard is it? I'm not really seeing it. But you go into the high schools now, and I'm hearing stories about kids being ostracized and removed from friend groups and being ridiculed by teachers and everything for their faith. And it's more and more and more. And so be of good cheer. Be encouraged. Stand firm. Because our God is ever present. He is all powerful. He is all knowing. And He will be with us. And He will use us. And He will reward us. And He will give us the strength that we need to stand when the times require such action.